Rock and roll. Okay, right, Ian, thank you so much for joining me today and giving up a bit of your time. I really appreciate it. I'm really excited about this conversation we're about to have. I'm fascinated by the behavioural side of transport. I was wondering if you could just start off by maybe introducing the work on motor normativity, where it came from, like what previous things in your life led you to that path?
Well, the motor normativity work started quite a few years ago, actually, with colleagues over at Bristol, Alan Tapp and Adrian Davis. And the three of us would quite often get together and have coffee and moan about the state of transport, as everyone in this world does. And one of the things we always come back to, as everybody in this world does, is the absolute difficulty of making change, and how so often you feel like you're banging your head on a brick wall trying to persuade people of the problem, or to make people recognize that something needs to be done. And you see this, people excusing the problems and acting as if cars crashing into people is just a thing that's going to happen that we can't control, almost like the weather. And we said, well, look, there's clearly something going on here. We've clearly got some kind of blind spot as a culture when it comes to transport. We're just not judging this rationally. So we said, well, look, step one, can we measure that? So Alan, Adrian and I, we found a little bit of money, and we paid a reputable market research company to do a national poll. We randomly gave people some questions about motoring, or some identical questions, but that weren't about motoring. And sure enough, in that first bit of work, we showed people answered the two sets of questions really differently. So if you mentioned cars, then all bets were off, and people stopped using their normal sense of right and wrong if you mentioned cars. So we showed that happened. Then very recently, just about 2 months ago, I published a follow-up paper with Marco de Brommelstruth from Netherlands, where we tried to get further into, well, how does this happen? What's causing this and what's shaping it? And what we showed, I think quite convincingly in that piece of work, was that it's shaped by your environment. It's shaped by multiple facets of your environment. It's shaped by the people around you. It's shaped by the built environment. It's shaped by the culture and the country that you live in, and whereabouts in the country you live. All of those things are shaping people's perceptions of how transport is a driving activity. Getting from place to place is done with cars. The problems of this are inevitable, and there's nothing we can do about it. And all of those things are being shaped by our surroundings.
Yeah, I've got so many notes and things to go through. It's fascinating. And on the Low Traffic Future website, I think I've realized we can add another section, because we have all the solutions. I think there's 6 we have there in terms of public transport, walking and cycling, freight, rural solutions for people that might want to not be so reliant on a car if they live out in the sticks. But we are missing a trick, because we don't have a section on behavior and behavior change and cultural change as well, which I'm fascinated by. So not that people aren't thinking about this stuff, lots of us do, but I wonder why, not just for Low Traffic Future, but also for organizations and local authorities, why we don't focus more on the behavior. Do you think there's a bit of a reluctance to, we're almost afraid to, or do you think it's almost we're too afraid to we don't feel like we're able to change people's behavior? It's something they should do themselves.
Oh, it's a really interesting question. And I think my first instinct, the first thing that comes to mind when you say that is, and this might be because I'm a psychologist that I think this, I've almost seen the opposite. I think what I've been seeing for quite a long time is almost too much focus on behavior change and not enough on enabling behavior. And I think you could probably have a really interesting conversation about why this has happened. I suspect a certain amount of the focus on individual behavior change, on encouraging people to travel more sustainably or more healthily, is partly because it's cheap and it doesn't upset anybody. It's one thing for me to persuade my neighbor that they really, really want to travel by bus because it doesn't cost any money and doesn't involve any infrastructure change. Actually providing a bus service is quite expensive and therefore much more challenging to do. And my perception is we've spent a lot of time trying to persuade people to do things differently, telling them, having an amazing poster, telling them how fun it would be to cycle to work or whatever, but we're not actually making it possible. And ultimately, there's quite a body of work now showing that if you want to really make change in this area and you want people to support change, actually the best thing you can do is to, on the one hand, enable it. There was a really nice American study a few years ago that showed the single best predictor of whether people walk is the question, is there a footpath? It doesn't matter what they think. Is there a footpath is a much better predictor of who walks and who doesn't. So you've got to have a physical world that encourages and enables the behavior that you want to see.
Yeah.
And we need to be going more in that direction rather than just telling people to do it. Like I say, I could stand in the street outside my house shouting about how great bus travel is until I'm blue in the face, but there's no buses. So what's the point persuading my neighbours to want to do it?
Yeah, I was on a call last night with my local authority, like an active travel update that keen local residents, keen cyclists, are given. And the council were talking about some of the great work they're doing around active travel to school and promoting walking and cycling to schools, which is great. And I wonder whether we do too much of that, because it's quite easy, because then later on in the conversation they were talking about the same thing they're doing but with businesses and older people, and the focus for the older people was more around enabling people to drive longer, or checking their eyesight, that kind of thing. And with businesses it was all about being safe when you're driving. There was no talk of cargo bikes for businesses or that kind of thing. So I was quite struck by the difference in language used when we're talking with young people and the school journey, the school trip. Whereas as it drifted into later in life, there was very much a motor normativity that, businesses need vans and lorries, and older people have to drive, so we're going to have to keep them on the road longer. So I was like banging my head against the wall a little bit.
Yeah, that's a really nice example of the motor normativity phenomenon there. This unspoken assumption that, well, look, we all know that obviously if people are going from A to B, it's got to be in a car. So how do we enable it to happen as much as possible? And it's a really good example, I think, of something that we see a lot of starting the conversation 3 steps down the chain. So often the conversation becomes, well, how will people drive? Where will we put the cars? Where's the cycle lane going to go? And we always start the conversation there, which, as you will know better than most people, very often puts people's backs up and leads to lots of miscommunication and leads to conflict. And it feels like what we need to be doing is starting the conversation several steps further back, of much bigger picture. What are we trying to do here? And it feels like there's a real opportunity for policymakers and politicians and councillors to be having conversations more like, how can we all have a great life in this place that we're living in? And we start with that conversation. And then the questions about where the cars go, where the bikes go, that can come 3 steps later, because they're a means to an end, not an end in themselves. But the conversation so often just starts with that and treats it as an end in its own right, rather than a means to an end.
Yeah. A low traffic future, we do try and do that. We do the website and the stuff we put out is supposed to be quite all encompassing and positive, this kind of positive vision, and it's supposed to appeal. I was actually thinking, like, the logo is green, and I was wondering whether I should change that, because people might associate us with Green Party values or that kind of thing, or eco stuff, whereas the things that we talk about should appeal to politics of all colours, and we've started thinking about how we can, on the eve of local elections where reform might do quite well, how we can appeal to potential reform voters, because the things we're talking about are kind of universally loved. It's tough times.
Well, I have a bit of a running joke, actually, which I think fits really nicely here, which I keep saying, tell me what you care about and I'll tell you how the answer is less cars. And I think it's interesting to think about from a sort of political perspective. So if I was speaking to somebody who was quite left-wing, I'd be saying, well, look, the answer is less cars, because cars isolate people in their homes, they disadvantage people who can't afford them, they cut off communities, and they lead to all sorts of problems. The harms of motoring, like air pollution and danger, disproportionately fall on people on lower incomes. And so there's no problem making an argument at the left-wing end of things about how we need less cars. But it's also there at the right end. If I was talking to a reform councillor, I might be saying, do you think it's okay for people to freeload off the state? Do you think it's okay for people to
Mhm.
demand that their lifestyle choices are paid for by taxpayers? Because that is what we're doing. When we allow someone to store their property in the street for free, that's a direct lifestyle subsidy to somebody from the taxpayer towards the wealthy. Now, I don't think if you put it in abstract terms, many people would support the idea that the taxpayer subsidizes people's lifestyle choices. But as soon as you mention cars, motor normativity kicks in and it's seen as something essential. But in the abstract, if we could get people to focus and recognize that what we're actually talking about is the state subsidizing people's lifestyles and people not paying their fair share towards what they consume, I think you'd probably be able to have that conversation at the right end of the political spectrum as well.
Definitely. It's absolutely fascinating. And I don't like to talk about it too much, but I'm a local councillor as well. And I do kind of have to think on my feet quite quickly when I'm door knocking and that kind of thing. And I do tailor the message around transport depending on what the person is saying. And if I'm getting a sense of which way they're leaning, that kind of way. But there's a lot of school traffic where I live. And I've actually, unusually for me this morning, I've hopped in the car and driven to my parents' house for, reasons I won't go into. But I drove through the school run traffic, which I actually haven't done in years and years, because I almost exclusively walk or ride to school with my youngest lad. But it's quite fascinating actually being in that world within the cocoon of our Volvo, which so many people see every day as their norm. And you do see the world from a completely different way. I'm happy to say there were lots of people walking, so there's loads of people that walk. And in fact, I think the research shows at our local schools that more families do walk or ride or scoot their children to school each morning. But there is a kind of motor normativity in there because cars are so big, they take up much space, they're noisy, that lots of people are driving. And there are too many, I would say. But there's fewer people driving than are walking and cycling. It's mad.
Well, that's really nice. And actually something you just made me think of when you were describing that experience of being in the car is my old colleague Birgitta Gattersleben at Surrey did some really neat work a few years ago where what they showed people footage of street scenes, but they showed them from three different perspectives. They either showed it from a pedestrian perspective, a bus user perspective, or a driver perspective, but you were seeing the same thing. And what they found was the more isolated you became, so as you went from the pedestrian to the bus and from the bus to the car, the more frightening the street scene became. And so what it suggests is that as you're more cocooned in that car, the chances are that outside feels more threatening because you're cocooned in the car. And then potentially you get these vicious cycles. So you're in the car, being isolated inside that car makes the outside world feel a bit less safe. So what do? Well, you stay in the car, which makes outside feel less safe and potentially reinforces itself in a loop.
There's that classic cartoon meme, isn't there, of the kind of the parents standing outside the car, the cartoon saying it's there's too much traffic, so we don't let the kids walk to school, that kind of thing. But fascinating. I'll move the conversation on a bit then to safety, because the stats will show that, and I think there was just a story yesterday, one of those horrendous deaths on the roads of the UK stories where a teenage driver had killed or been involved in a collision, and 3 of his mates were killed in the car. So we see these stories every day. Sometimes they make it onto the front page of the BBC website for the particularly horrendous ones. But local newspapers, there's almost always a road traffic collision story on the front the front page of my local website, and yet we kind of ignore the royal we, the lack of safety on the roads, and we for some reason we feel safe within a car. So what is going on there?
It feels like, again, I think it's another facet of this motor normativity of the fact that everybody alive today has only ever known a world where this is normal and normalized. And so it feels like you get this unique treatment of motoring. In any other domain, if people were just being killed like that out of the blue, we'd take action. But I find it so depressing. I see these stories as well. And you look at them and you think, okay, there we go. There's several young lives just cut short like that unexpectedly. It's absolutely traumatizing for their families. Nothing will be done. No action will be taken to prevent this happening again next week. and no action will be taken then to prevent it happening again. And it becomes quite depressing, the helplessness that people display, because we've just become so conditioned to view this as something that is inevitable, and it is absolutely not inevitable. And that's this really unfortunate outcome of growing up in a motor first environment and having your perceptions of what's normal and correct shaped by that environment.
So what's the rationality there in the human mind? Because rationally speaking, we should be a bit risk averse, and we should like avoid driving as much as possible. I mean, I know like per kilometer or per million kilometers driving is relatively safe, especially in this country actually, compared to others like the US. And yet we are confronted by these stories, you know, every day. And most people listening to this will know of someone either in the direct family or friends that have been involved in a collision, you know, of varying severity. So what's the thing in our minds that's kind of saying that despite that risk, we're still happy to hop in cars so frequently?
Ooh, I mean, that's a massive question, and I could barely do justice to that. But I could say the first couple of things that come to mind. I mean, one is that, you know, humans are not great rational creatures. You know, we're not brilliant decision makers, and we're not terribly good at weighing up evidence. We don't treat evidence the same. Economists have shown very often that we treat losses much more seriously than we treat gains, and all this sort of thing. And obviously, of course, even in the best situation, it's what economists would call bounded rationality, which is at best you can be rational within the boundaries of what you know, and so on. So we're never going to be perfect in this. There's other facets to this as well, though. And I think a really nice one that came to mind was, and again, it's probably an example of bounded rationality, an example of the limits on how we view these things, is that distinction between health and safety. So, you know, you're absolutely right that being inside a car is a fairly safe thing. But actually, what we've known for a long time is that being inside a car is probably putting your life expectancy down, because the getting out of the car and making these everyday trips on foot or on a bicycle or public transport, we know that that's associated with longer, healthier life if we can zoom out and look at the big picture. But, you know, people are not doing that. People are obviously, as we know, generally just thinking about the next trip. They're just thinking, like, I just need to get the kids to school, whatever. They're focused on these very narrow things and not looking at the big picture. And arguably, why should they? You know, is it reasonable to expect a member of the public to be downloading huge numbers of spreadsheets and doing massive long-term analysis? That's what people like me are for, and enacting that is probably what people, policymakers and politicians, are for. But we probably need to get a bit bolder about it, and we need, you know, probably especially central government, a much stronger communication of, look, we want people to have longer, healthier, happier lives. And the best known way we've ever seen to do this, you know, the miracle pill, as it's often called, is creating a world in which everyday, easy, accessible physical activity becomes possible.
I get quite frustrated locally as well, because we do have some great, in my local area, documents around enabling active travel and getting more people on public transport. But for example, it doesn't seem to be joined up with our local NHS services, where it's just not mentioned at all. We've got a little bit of social prescribing going on, I think, which is quite cool. But for example, when consultations come out around active travel schemes or local transport plan stuff, which has been going through recently in the Liverpool City region, I have to really try hard to get like local NHS services and people I know, thankfully, that work within those organizations, like to fill out the consultations, you know, to shout really loudly that, for example, local hospitals are well connected by walking, cycling, public transport. There doesn't seem to be that knowledge or emphasis within of the importance of this stuff. And you can see it in the physical realm, because if you go to my local hospital, which I do every now and again, Arrow Park Hospital on the Wirral, you can just about make out the hospital building, like beyond that, the sea of car parking, you know. So I guess, is that because staff, even if they do get the bus to work or they ride a bike, is it because staff are just so used to seeing that scene as they arrive on work that they're assuming that that needs to be the same thing for the rest of eternity?
Well, there certainly seems to be an element of that, and as I'm sure you know, driving to hospitals and parking at hospitals is such a political hot potato.
Yeah.
Partly because I think, again, there's just this unspoken automatic assumption that that is the only way that a hospital can be accessed. But I mean, just going back to what you were saying in the build up there, I think what's really interesting, and again, this is not a novel observation, but it's the fragmentation of decision making is a real issue. One of the reasons I find transport so interesting, and one of the reasons I like working in transport, is partly that people care about it. I also work in things like energy and water and things like this. They're important, but people don't sit around in the pub talking about them in the way that they do about their everyday journeys. It matters to people. The other reason I like studying transport is it touches everything. So, I'm going to go into the office after we finish talking. And that journey has multiple implications at a decision-making perspective. It's got land use implications, it's got health implications, obviously transport implications, but it also affects things like social connections and communities and all these sorts of things. Each of those things I just mentioned sits with a different decision maker. The transport planner is not in the same office as the health person who's having their service propped up by my not getting unhealthy, by my physical activity, and all of these things are segregated. And so it feels like one of the places we potentially need some action is at that higher level. Mayoral level is probably a good place for it in a lot of parts of Britain, to pull together towards that common goal of the benefits that more healthy travel could create, or ideally prime ministerial level. But this separation of things across departments, and of course, environmental being another one, everyone's got their different little slice of the pie, but we never look at the whole pie very often.
They do, yeah. And even within transport, there are a lot of silos, and that's partly what Low Traffic Future is attempting to do, is to kind of bring lots of different organizations together, which all have their own little niche speciality, and try to get a lot of like system level thinking. Because even on this call last night, I was listening to our fantastic road safety team locally. They're doing really good work, but they're not necessarily thinking that a really good road safety intervention or road danger reduction intervention for certain main roads or would be better infrastructure, whether that be cycle lanes or bus stop bypasses or that kind of thing. It's all about getting the police out with the speed cameras and that kind of thing.
And that's a really good example. So you could imagine, say, at mayoral level, someone going, well, look, if we can get that road safety team going, that's literally going to reduce pressure on the hospital down the line. Because if you've got safe streets and streets that feel safe, people are going to walk and cycle more. That's giving them greater physical activity, which is causing less chronic illness. It's tackling diabetes and Alzheimer's and all these kinds of things. But it's that, we need someone to do the joining up of the teams.
Yeah, I want to bring the conversation on to what you mentioned, energy there before, and the kind of things that fellas or people don't talk about down the pub. I read recently about the rise of the net zero dad, and I'm one of those like net zero dads who wants to talk about heat pumps and solar panels and constantly checking on. Like I should be pulling about 1.5 kilowatts in through my solar panels today, right now, and a bit like 20 plus. I'm hoping for a record breaking day on my solar panels, so stand by on blue sky. But yeah, I want to talk a little bit about your research and bring it into transport on showers. So could you introduce the research that you helped with a few years ago and explain what was going on there?
Yeah, this was a really funny coming together of things. So for me, it started many years ago. I was just doing a little consultancy project for one of the energy companies. And as part of that, we got a bunch of households and we measured household dynamics. So we got couples who lived together and we were looking at who used what in the house. And one of the things that we measured there, because we basically put little devices next to the washing machine and the TV and the shower and so on. And we measured how much each person in the house used each device. And one of the things that jumped out a bit was the showers. That in every house we looked at, we found that one person tended to use the shower a lot more than the other. And it wasn't the obvious gender difference you're expecting here. It was kind of not really related to gender. There was just always one person who was in there a lot longer than the other. And so, I've done a bit of things like that. I then had a PhD student who did some sort of related work on showers. And then about 3 or 4 years ago, I got a job at the University of Surrey. And shortly after I arrived, I met this couple of guys from the tourism department there. And we got introduced and they said, oh, yeah, we do work on people's showers. And I mean, it's not often you bump into somebody else who goes around measuring how long people spend in the shower. And they'd been doing it in hotels, which is actually a really interesting situation because, of course, in a hotel, there's no incentive to save water or energy because you've paid the bill. So if you stay in the shower for 6 hours, it costs you the same. So that was a really interesting question that they were looking at. And then together, we did a load of work at Surrey where we had measuring devices in showers all across the campus in the student residences. And we're looking at what influenced people's consumption in those showers. And showers really matter because it's not only water consumption, which can be quite important in some parts of the country, but it's hot water consumption. This is water that's been heated up to 60, 70 degrees. That's a lot of energy. If you think of the energy it takes to raise 10 liters of water from room temperature to shower temperature, absolutely. It's a lot of energy and you're burning through that every minute. So it's a really important thing. And one of the reasons that whole thing was so interesting to me as a psychologist is it's in the bathroom. And that's one of the few places where none of us know what everybody else does. So I mentioned earlier when I was talking about motor normativity, the environments that shape our perceptions, the environments that tell us what's normal. And we've known for a long time that a massive part of that, one of the biggest influences on what all of us think is normal and a massive influence on what all of us do is what we see other people do. We're social animals. We do internalize what we see other people doing, and that shapes our sense of what's normal. Now, the bathroom is a really interesting place because it's one of the very few situations where you do not know what everybody else does. And you could sit next to somebody and that person next to you routinely consumes 10 times more than you do. Now, that doesn't happen elsewhere. That doesn't happen with food. It doesn't happen with clothes. These things just don't tend to happen in the same way elsewhere. But we are incredibly variable in the bathroom. And so it's proved to be a really useful place to look at what happens when you take away the social norms. Now, that PhD student I mentioned, one of the fun things we did there was to put the social norms back in. So, for example, we measured a load of people's showers and then told them explicitly how normal they were. And we kind of made it up. It was quite fun. We gave people random numbers. We'd say, you are 6 minutes longer than average or something like this with random numbers. And what we found is almost everybody immediately tried to become more normal as soon as you told them what it was. So if you told somebody their shower was above average, it would almost instantly get shorter. And if you told them their shower was below average, they would almost immediately start taking longer. So people do want to be normal, and we showed it, but it's not normally there in the showers. Now, there's the interesting link, of course, to transport is that in transport, we do go out in the street all the time. All of us do see what is normal. And one of the downsides here, one of the risks to be a little bit negative is, I think one of the things we've been seeing a lot is this increasing normalization of deviance, to use a phrase that comes out of research. Wow. So a really good example, I think, that I've observed in recent years is the normalization of parking on pavements. And I think any of us who's been paying attention has seen that that's just become more and more and more normalized, where I think it's pretty clear to a lot of people that that is just how you park these days. I'm parking the car, bump it up, there we go. And you can even see people in roadside laybys bumping it up on the pavement, even though it's not even a pavement, because it's just, that's how you park. And the more that people are allowed and enabled and encouraged to do antisocial or dangerous things in the street, and the more they get away with it, the more this stuff will become normalized. And so, again, I think this really points towards the idea we need to be doing higher level intervention. We need to be building streets where risky behavior is not really possible so that it can't be normalized. We probably need a bit more policing. We need maybe more speed enforcement, all of these things that are going to help combat this normalization of risky or dangerous or antisocial driving, purely because of the massive imbalance that this raises. And if you're walking down the street and I'm driving down it, there is such an imbalance between the two of us. The harm I can cause you is so much greater than the harm you can cause me. And we need to be addressing that imbalance in a more structural way, I would argue. But at the moment, that imbalance is not only there, it's also the harms that come from it are being normalized and potentially even facilitated.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And the pavement parking thing, good point, because I get to witness some. I walk to school. There's a small section of main road where kids at the age of 17, 18, so sixth formers, have now got the freedom of driving mum or dad's or auntie or uncle's Fiesta to school every morning, and they can park for free on the road. And when they run out of space on the road, they can go on the other side. And yeah, I get to see cars parked partially on the pavement. They usually leave enough space to walk through, but that's not the point. But I'm fascinated by how quickly, you know, these folks, they've often got like the P sign on the front of the car to say they've just passed the test. I'm parking on the pavement. Like, so either they're obviously doing it because it's a social norm, I think, but the driving instructor might not have told them. You quite often see driving instructors parked partially on the pavement. The road safety team I've met with yesterday was stopping folks speeding. It was a community speed watch thing, so it was like a bit of a slap on the wrists. But they stopped a driving instructor who was doing 28 in a 20-mile-an-hour zone, you know, and these social norms, yeah, they just creep in, and from a very quick age. So these kids, it depresses me, because kids that will have been getting taught about the harms of environmental harms in school, which we do a lot of stuff for that in education, about, you know, the plastic in the ocean, all that kind of stuff, the harms of motoring, and then as soon as they turn 17, they're in a car and they're parking on the pavement, and they're just like, yeah, I feel like just curling up in a ball and crying. But it's a social norm, right?
It's normative, and again, if people see that, if people come to believe for whatever reason, or come to accept that mobility, getting from place to place, is the same as driving, and that driving is the way that you move from place to place, then, you know, inevitably we're going to get into this. But even then, I think there's bits it doesn't explain. So, for example, even if we just say, oh, look, there's a problem that people think that the way to get from place to place is driving, that's certainly not explaining everything. That doesn't explain why so many people drive large cars. Yeah, it doesn't explain the rise of the SUV and the pickup truck and all of this stuff, because there's clearly a lot more to that than just getting from place to place. There's clearly a lot going on about social signaling and status and all of these things.
Yeah.
So it's clearly a multifaceted, complex issue.
I was in Northumberland over Easter, and in a beautiful old town up there, and there was a stonemason doing some great work. And in fact, I saw this vehicle a couple of times on my travels in Northumberland. Obviously highly thought of and do really good work, masonry. But they had this really cool old 70s maybe Daihatsu, I think it was, this old pickup truck, single cab, so it was just, you know, for two, maybe three people across the front bench, and it's really practical, but long bed on the back, and the side folded down so that you could get all his tools. And you could tell it was built, this machine, A, to last a long time, but also B, to be really super practical, so they could get loads of their stuff off the side and lift heavy things off. Whereas you see a modern massive double cab pickup truck, they look really impractical. The bed is really high up, so I would struggle to lift things out of it. There's not much space. They don't seem to last that long. The reports I see that they're built really badly. So yeah, I have got on my list to talk about the SUVification of the world, because yeah, that's another fascinating area that we could talk probably for hours about.
Yeah, and there's clearly lots going on. I mean, one of the things I think is really interesting, you know, again, there's clearly that big picture stuff that, you know, we know that one of the reasons behind the rise of this is the tax incentives to business owners. I think one of the things that's quite fun at a down on the street level is to look at who those business owners are. And it's quite interesting when you see pickup trucks with the livery of things like hairdressers. And, you know, there's one round here that's a Japanese restaurant, and you think, come on, the sushi is not that heavy that you need it in the back. You need a pickup truck to move it around. So, there's clearly a lot of people leaping on the bandwagon of the tax incentives that were probably intended for builders.
Yes.
But, clearly people are drawn to driving big, beefy cars.
My neighbor was a friend of a neighbor was given one with work because it was kind of the only company car that was obviously like financially viable for his business, and he works in medical sales, and he was like, he didn't want to be driving around in this massive hulking machine to look hospitals around the region. But yeah, I think that loophole is closed now, so it'll be interesting to see how quickly we can revert back. Yeah.
And again, it comes back to the incentives and the structures around it. So quite funny, a few weeks ago, one of my local neighbours got in touch. She didn't realise we were neighbours. She got in touch with me at work, and then it turned out we live on the same street. And she got in touch and said, I'm worried about how people are driving really fast through the junction at the end of the street. And we met up for a chat, and within about 2 minutes, I was saying, well, listen, the thing you have to understand about why people speed through the junction at the end of our street is the global finance system. Because these things do connect, because, the way we buy and use cars, like these pickups and so on, is shaped by the car industry's business model having fundamentally shifted over the last 15 or 20 years from selling cars to selling finance. And yes. The car being a vehicle, if you'll forgive it. The cars are a vehicle in order to shift finance. So the cars need to become premiumized. The cars need to be more expensive. They need to have all the bells and whistles. They need to be as big as possible so that the sticker price goes up, so that you can sell longer finance deals and so on and so on.
Yes.
And this is why, again, it becomes so, I think we can turn this back quite nicely to the behavior change thing. I can talk to my neighbor and say, well, listen, I think you should do something a bit different. And obviously there's some role for that. But to ask my neighbor to fix this through their behavior, when we're talking about global financial systems that are incentivizing people to buy and continually drive oversized cars, it's a bit David and Goliath, isn't it?
Absolutely. I'm just trying to dig out. There's some great research done by a chap whose name I've forgotten, Tom something, around the financialization of the car industry that came out, I think, last year. It's one of those things that should be getting a lot more attention, and it's just one of those things that's so important, but doesn't really get talked about too much. But I mean, our old Volvo is starting to show its age a little bit. It'll go as long as it needs to, but I was looking at car financing for new cars, and it's just so easy to get hold of one for on a relatively low monthly cost. And fair play to the car industry, man. They've just gamed that so well, haven't they?
Well, and I mean, I'd encourage your listeners here to go and have a little look at a few car companies' websites and see what the figures are, because some of them are really interesting. Yes, you can buy the real small end. I suspect something like a Suzuki. I suspect you can get that for £250 a month. But if you go and look at the prestige cars, let's face it, our streets are not short of Land Rover Defenders right now. That's been a massive success by arguably playing on the vanity of the population. Those things are kind of £800 plus a month to rent. You don't even own it on these PCP deals. Now, when you see someone driving one of those and you know that they are paying hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pounds a month just to have that vehicle, and they could have £500 a month more in their pocket for a vehicle that does the same job, you realize what you're up against. But also these figures, even at the low end, even the person who's paying £250 a month or something like that for the cheaper end of car finance, it's still at a level where why on earth would you not do every single journey in it? When you're paying those sorts of figures, you're so incentivized to jump in the car. Why would you take a bus? Why would I pay £4 or £5 to go on the bus when I've already paid for that car there? Why would I walk when I've already paid for that car there? And tying people into these finance deals feels like a real problem for, essentially painting people into a corner, or people painting themselves into a corner a lot of the time, and taking away their own incentive to do other things.
Yeah, there's a house not too far from me that I'm fascinated by, and I'd love to build up the courage one day to knock and speak to them. They've got 3 SUVs on the driveway. One is a Defender, actually. The poster child of like horrendous SUVs, but 3 SUVs, all within about 3 years old, I'd say. 2 of them are electric, fair dues. But I reckon the lease costs, assuming they're leased, must be £2,500–3,000 a month just in lease. There's a bus stop right outside the house, so that adds to the fascination. So I wonder if there's a sort of reverse frugality, whether part of the prestige is the cost itself. You know, it's sort of flashing your Rolex watch or something like that. Sometimes I see people jangling the car keys outside school gates, and I think that's a little social cue that I've driven to school, or maybe look at the car keys. It's what's the badge on the key, that kind of thing that they've done subconsciously. I'm not saying people are evil or that kind of thing, but yeah, there's a huge amount of psychology going on here, isn't there?
Yeah, and cars as status symbols is definitely a thing. I mean, you know, we did a little bit of work on this a few years ago. We did some really long interviews with people who'd recently bought a new car, and one of the things that came out of there really notably was the importance of the image. But what was interesting with the image, and the reason we did long interviews, is we wanted to see what people said early on, you know, what was at the forefront of their mind and that they found really easy to talk about, and what they only talked about late in the interviews, what was sort of at the back of their minds. And we found that image and identity and status typically would come up really late in the conversation. It's something people didn't have at the forefront of their mind. But once they got onto it, they talked about it an incredible amount. When they finally got onto the subject, they would talk about it almost as much as they talked about money at the start of the conversation. So it's clearly extremely important to people, but they don't realize how important it is to them.
Wow. Okay, I'll start to wrap things up now, because I know you've got to get off, and I'm really grateful for your time. I want to try and finish on a bit of a message of hope, really, we've got transport targets all over the place, especially in the UK. We need to reduce traffic, although it doesn't get talked about too much. Do you think we're gonna get there by kind of hook or by crook? Do you think we're going to get there rationally, or do you think things like COVID, when that hit, we saw this amongst the horror of it all? We saw this explosion in active travel, didn't we? Which, do you think we're going to be forced into changes in transport by some other strain? Like yesterday, we had this power cut in Spain and Portugal, which, like, the transport system shut down and people had to figure it out. I assume we'll find out in the wash. People had to figure out ways of getting around. Yeah, what's your thoughts on what's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years on transport? In 2 minutes.
Well, yeah, no pressure. I mean, just on that Spanish thing, one of the things that is, I think, a genuine problem with our current state of affairs, and again, this is an argument that I think resonates right across the political spectrum, and especially at the right end, we have put all our eggs in one basket. We have no resilience in a car-centered transport system. The slightest bit of congestion, the slightest roadwork, and everything grinds to a halt. One crash on the motorway and 50,000 people are stuck. You know, so there's no resilience in that system. So that in itself is a reason to try and do things a bit differently, no matter where you are on the political spectrum. I think longer term, I think what is going to be needed is leadership. You know, we know, so I can come at this from two directions. Down at the psychology end, down at my end, there's a lot of good research, including some stuff that's really popped up just in the last 2 or 3 years, showing that the direction of these things is the opposite to what we think it is. We like to think that it goes like this. I think it's a good idea to travel in a certain way, and so I do it. You know, that's how it feels to be a human being. There's so much evidence that it often goes the other way around. Your environment makes it easy to travel in a certain way. Therefore, you do it, and therefore, you think it's a good idea. So very often the thinking something is a good idea comes after doing it, not before. So the implication of this, and this has been shown multiple times and tested, is we need environments that make active, healthy travel easy. And we need those first, because once you've got those environments, people will start to do it. And they will then start to come around to the idea that it's a good idea, because fundamentally we like what we do. You can then come at this from the global perspective. You know, we look at places like Paris being a very good example, where we've had that leadership to say, no, look, we need to give people alternatives. We need to give people choice in terms of how they get around. But in order to do that, we need to build an environment where people have choice. And sure enough, you see those influences. It's not going to be easy, but that's the kind of leadership we need. And as part of this, I'm going to say something really unpopular here. As part of this, we're going to need to have some very difficult conversations about people painting themselves into corners. So one of the things that always comes up in this conversation is, oh, well, it's all right for you in a town or a city. What about people in rural areas? And as part of this, we're probably going to need to have a conversation about why are people living in rural areas when they're not farmers, you know. And I'm obviously joking a little bit here, but you know, at the end of the day, you know, we do need to be saying, is it okay? Is it okay to go and live out in the sticks for lifestyle reasons and expect everybody else to support that decision through picking up your pollution and, you know, so on and so on. So we probably need to have some difficult conversations as part of this, but fundamentally it's going to be, you know, we need that leadership.
Yeah, fascinating. I saw a bit of an article last week. I'll link to it around, there was a bit of buyer's regrets. A family had moved out into the sticks like in COVID for some fresh air, and they wanted to do more running and cycling, and then they found out, it was posted yesterday online, that actually they feel quite hemmed in. They can't get anywhere without a car, that kind of thing. It's not safe to cycle on a lot of rural roads. So be careful what you wish for and all that.
But I saw that same article actually. Yeah, and I think what's the little depressing thing is that so many people are in exactly that same position but haven't even noticed. They don't notice how limited they've become by having to get in the car for every single thing they ever want to accomplish. And again, going back to what I said half an hour ago, wouldn't it be nice if we shifted the conversation around to what do I want out of life? What should life be? And, you know, when my wife and I moved house a couple of years ago, the conversation always began with, look, wherever we end up, you've got to be able to walk to a shop and a pub. Because that's an important element of life. Because if you can walk to a shop and you can walk to a pub, you've got community, you've got facilities, you've got food. And so we need to start these conversations with what we're trying to get out of life and how can transport help us get those goals that we want out of our lives, rather than just always beginning the wrong way around of starting with talking about transport.
Beautiful, yeah. And a little hopeful image I saw, this village we stay in Northumberland 2 or 3 times a year. There are now 2 elderly gentlemen with electric trikes in a very hilly village, and they're well connected to shops and pubs, and it's just amazing to see them so leading the way and yeah, hopefully shifting the culture a little bit and in little places like that. Okay, great. So just finally then, really grateful for your time. I joked before we came on air that you haven't got a book to sell, but you do actually, don't you? What? So not that you're here to sell it, I'm joking, but yeah, folks can keep up with you online, and where the best places to find out who you are and what you're doing in the future as well, Ian.
Yeah, if anyone does want to find me for whatever reason, well, no, for good reasons, if anyone wants to find me, then I've got a website at drianwalker.com, drianwalker.com. I've got a book. Yes, I do have a book. Everyone has a book. Mine's called Endless Perfect Circles, which was a book about going from doing no sport whatsoever to breaking a Guinness World Record for cycling across Europe, which I did a few years ago. And otherwise, I'm quite active on Blue Sky. So Ian Walker on Blue Sky.
That's where all the transport nerds are hanging out now. It's a very cool place. All right, Ian, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And yeah, best of luck.
Thanks, Ed.